What do a speaking coach, a strategy consultant, and a climate tech company builder have in common? Sounds like the start of a bad joke, right? But honestly, it's all about finding out what people really do with their jobs. The stories, the struggles, the coffee breaks. The real stuff you won't find in a job title.
Welcome to a space where we sit down with people from all kinds of careers, have a laugh, and dive into what makes their work meaningful. Whether you're looking to learn something new or just here for a good story, let us be your guide. I'm Jeff.
And I'm Charlie.
And let's get casually
bro.
Yay! Today we are sitting with Thomas Schuldt. Thomas, you're the Vice President of Business Development and Strategy at DG Matrix, a company that develops sustainable energy technologies for AI data centers, microgrids, we'll talk more about it later, and electric vehicle charging. You're a man driven by the mission to stop climate change while advancing human progress further. I'm very happy to be here with you today. Can you start, please, by telling us who you are, what you do, and how you got there?
Hey, sure thing. Jeff Charles, really a pleasure to be here with you and spend the next hour with you. Indeed, my name is Thomas Schuldt. I'm originally from Germany, and I spent the majority of my time in the past more than 10 years and my studies before dedicated to solving the big challenge of climate change. And currently, indeed, I am the VP of Business Development and Strategy at DG Matrix, where we commercialize solid state transformers. Solid state transformers are a new technology which enables you to integrate renewable energy into your building loads, into the grid, and a lot of other new technologies, and ultimately really make sure that efficient electricity is delivered low cost, efficiently, reliably, and in a clean way to wherever you need it to. How I got here was I studied business undergrad, international business undergrad, spent 2 years in Germany and 2 years in Spain. Then really noticed that I wanted to learn much more about sustainability than only the one lecture I had during my undergrad time, and spent 1.5 years doing a master's degree in sustainability management at Columbia University in New York, and really got a lot of exposure to different parts of sustainability, kind of in its nascency, when people were still talking about direct emissions only and ignoring indirect emissions. But at the same time, also really looking into the different aspects of sustainability from an engineering perspective, a markets perspective, a policy perspective, and a climate science perspective, which is something that I really enjoyed. And after graduating from this program, I really said to myself, okay, I want to dedicate my career to focusing on sustainability, and specifically, I would say a bit more on the environmental sustainability side. So stopping climate change and all the emissions, and joined a very inspiring company called NRG Energy. Um, the NRG actually stands for non-regulated generator, as opposed to a funny way of saying energy, the electron thing. And they had a very inspiring CEO called David Crane. And David Crane was a guy who pushed the entire kind of old school utility industry into the new age, and was wanting to make sure that the utility becomes the Facebook, Apple, or Amazon of the energy industry. And that was, I think, a really appealing thing for me to join. And I became a rotational business associate, spent some time at different parts of the company, for example, helping to build energy storage projects, helping to integrate different distributed energy resources, such as small solar facility, small batteries, demand response, and a lot of other things into one big thing, which you could bid into the market. And I also spent a lot of time just on renewable energy. So thinking about where to install new solar power plants, where to install storage, and how to make it happen. And after that, I was here in the US as a Fulbright scholar. I needed to return to my home country, and there's this 2-year home residency requirement with barely any way around. So I happily returned to Germany and moved to Berlin, spent 2 years in management consulting. Um, and that was very interesting. I joined initially thinking because sustainability was not that big yet in the sector that I would maybe do one sustainability related project and 99 projects which were completely unrelated. But in the end, it turned out that sustainability was really picking up, and I spent a lot of time working with, for example, cost optimization of wind turbine makers, portfolio strategies for utility companies with focus on renewable energy, and then also thinking about the future of how to create a more sustainable world. And I decided to go on a secondment, spent 1.5 years at the WWF, World Wildlife Fund, or Worldwide Fund for Nature in Malaysia. Was a lobbyist for plastic circular economy, doing sustainability in the field, influenced a bunch of lawmaking processes there, to implement extended producer responsibility schemes, which basically help to emit less plastic in nature. And then returned to McKinsey, was part of the green business building practice, spent a bunch of years hyperscaling startups, with a focus on green technologies. So helping them, for example, with a business plan, with investor roadmaps, fundraising strategies, and so forth. And ultimately decided to join one of those companies because I really wanted to move from being an advisor and making slides to really making things happen in the world and deploying hardware products. And here we are at DG Matrix now. We recently raised a significant round of money, and this money really gives us the flexibility to scale climate tech solutions and to focus on the specific solid state transformers, which we're implementing now with data centers and with microgrids.
Wow, it seems like you've had quite a run in terms of your career, going from everything from a management consultant all the way through to actually making the changes that you wanted to see through your company right now. And as someone who currently works in consulting and currently uh, you know, helps businesses scale and figure out their financial needs, it can feel definitely a little bit outside in, looking into processes and feeling the tug of, okay, I want to actually make the changes that I am currently seeing, instead of just throwing them on a slide deck and say you should or you could do XYZ thing. So you and I know your pain. But you know, going back, because I think there is such a genuine care and love that you have for sustainability and environmental causes. Um, I'm a sucker for stories. I really enjoy learning about the people side of why, they go into the areas that they want to go into. Um, and you strike me as someone who might have a deeper fascination in environmental causes than just, happening upon them during your collegiate years. Could you tell us the story of why you wanted to go into environmental, I guess, business?
Yeah. I think what really shaped me were my parents, my mom being a vet, my dad being a biologist, always really showing us the future, the beauty of the nature, and really explaining us how everything works and experiencing nature through camping trips, hikes, and a lot of other things. Lots of science books, as you can imagine, with different animals and plants. And I think that was already really shaping, and then moving a bit over to thinking about how to, or showing us to how to preserve these beautiful things for future generations, while being aware, for example, um, looking at nature catastrophes, for example, forest fires or floods, and understanding where these or what's causing them, and yes, they're part of our natural cycle anyways, but climate change is definitely exacerbating them or making them worse. So that's one, I think, of the reasons or one of the things that really shaped me. And I remember actually this funny thing. I think when I was something like 5 years, 6 years old, I went to this expo of a random expo, and one of the booths there had these tiny solar rotors, and I was very fascinated by the solar rotor just moving effortlessly without any electricity going in. And my parents actually got me this little solar rotor, and that might be something that might have inspired me for a long time. It kept working for many, many years. And I think my parents then also stepped up their game in the sense of being one of the first ones to install solar heat on our roof and powering part of our warm water generation in our place with the sun, and then being one of the first movers too, with around 20 years, 25 years ago, installing photovoltaic solar panels on our roof to generate electricity and feed it back into the grid, which ultimately, with many millions of people doing it and many subsidies obviously going into it, led to cost downs and the whole world adopting solar so that it's really mainstream now and one of the main energy generation sources, which is really, really low cost in many places on our planet. And that was, I think, really inspiring in the sense of the fascination for you can actually do something with technology about climate change. And if you then leverage our capitalist system to make it work by finding smart ways to drive down economics and foster adoption, that was really something where I wanted to get involved and make it happen. And ultimately, that's what really motivates me and keeps driving me now.
Wow, that's a great story, Thomas, and it's really a great example to show how, as parents, we can have a huge influence on our children. And as a parent myself, it's something that gives a lot of food for thoughts. You are
Mhm.
the example that you show, the biggest example that you show to your children. And this is I think this is it's that's what underlines the story. At least maybe it's because I'm a parent of a young child, which I think you are too.
Indeed.
Yes,
Yes.
indeed. um, so the question I wanted to ask you, Thomas, you're not just any dreamer. You are a businessman. You have been trained in business, so you perfectly know that dreams have to make business sense if they were to be materialized in the world. And I wonder where we are today in terms of climate change. And we know we need a lot of energy. And I wonder on the business side, where are we? Are we in a space where there is a lot of hope, when you can foresee great things coming? Please tell us what you can see from your vantage point.
Yeah, great question. I'm an optimist by nature, so I would preempt this by saying that there is actually a lot of hope. I think first we have the right technologies available. For example, with solar and batteries already being so economic and wind energy, that's really something great where we can make a massive dent already to make sure that electrons are created in a green way as opposed to in a way resulting from burning fossil fuels. I think also there are a lot of other technologies which help with efficiency. For example, LEDs as opposed to incandescent light bulbs, making a huge difference too in slowing down energy consumption. And I think there is just a lot of technologies that are already economically available to make a difference, and a lot in the pipeline that will probably make a massive difference. And I think that's great. And I think it's also great to see that many of them are already mainstream, which means they're profitable. Investors find that they're mature enough to not question any of those projects anymore in many parts of the world. So that's great. I think the sad thing, unfortunately, is that the fossil fuel industry is still very, very strong in terms of their lobbying, in terms of ingrained relationships they've been able to build over the past decades or 100 years. And that's really something where I think the many governments are still treating the new low carbon technologies unfairly by keeping up their billion-dollar subsidies for fossil fuels or other polluting technologies. And I think that's, for example, a rather simple enabler where I would say, let's make a change by aligning economic incentives and creating a level playing field for different technologies as opposed to keeping up subsidies, which actually make things worse for our planet and ultimately even impact the voters because if you keep up that coal power plant running and you have SOx and NOx emissions and other emissions, that directly translates, unfortunately, into prematurely ended lives. And that's something, and lots of respiratory diseases and other issues, which is certainly something that we can already profitably avoid now.
You bring up a really interesting point, and I think it's something that a lot of people in the innovation space don't talk about, uh, because it's kind of a dirty little secret. The idea that, you know, everyone is very publicly entrenched in the idea of, okay, let's make things more sustainable, let's make things more green. Let's even on the face invest in these different alternatives to create a better, more sustainable future. But as someone who works in the innovation space, outside of some key areas, at least I can speak in the United States here, um, it's very, very hard to find funding, and even generalized support for startups in the green space. I am lucky enough to have been well traveled inside of the United States, and I visit places like Seattle and San Francisco and Texas and the Midwest, and you know the one thing that I see in common with all of these innovation spaces and budding innovation spaces is that people on their face are very open about their support for these green initiatives, but when it comes to opening their wallets or making calls to any kind of movers or shakers, there's definitely a hesitancy. I mean, as someone who works specifically in funding and helping scale businesses like that, um, have you felt like there has been that hesitation? And if so, uh, how are you combating that?
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's been very interesting times. And I remember when before the secondment I did and taking the 1.5 years off from consulting, sustainability really was very limited. And then coming back, or even during the secondment, I noticed that everyone was talking about plastic in the years of 2020, 2021, and how to make sure that no plastic ends up in nature. So I noticed the difference there. And I also noticed then how when coming back to consulting, all of a sudden there was this massive SPAC boom and so many companies, many climate tech companies actually raised dozens or hundreds of millions of dollars to scale, sometimes even billions of dollars. And that was really impressive. But then all of a sudden, many of these SPAC companies weren't able to live up to the expectations of their investors. So the momentum slowed down a bit there, and I think a bit of trust issues were also what was going on, where people thought, okay, that's a bit of an exaggeration of the markets, but the low interest environment kept pushing like the good times a bit longer than maybe many people would have expected, and a bunch of climate tech companies then kept raising a lot of money, which was great. But now, indeed, the funding momentum has certainly slowed down. There's still a lot of dry powder, which is very promising, but investors are really, really careful in terms of which company to pick and give them a bunch of millions or more to scale. And it's certainly an issue. And I think what you can do there is really focus on technologies that help generate value and make a true difference. Sometimes actually not the most complex technology solutions, but rather really things which have been technically de-risked mostly, but just need a bit of commercial momentum, and where you can also show and combat, for example, the challenges in the sense of showing some initial momentum, some prototypes early on makes a lot of sense, partnerships, some initial sales. If you can showcase all of these things and really put together these puzzle pieces as small as they are, that's where you can already make a huge difference. And I think the or the dynamics have changed a bit in the sense of investors not funding that much a vision of a company anymore, but rather really wanting to see at least some traction on the ground to pump in more money into a company.
You know, it's really funny because we've been lucky enough to have a couple of either institutional investors or angels on the show, and they all agree on the one thing, that the stupid money is gone.
Hmm.
In a high interest rate environment, there's no kind of leeway to invest in, higher risk businesses that have more of a pie in the sky feeling, especially
Hmm.
when it comes to, any kind of ESG or uh, types of businesses that don't have like a dedicated return attached to it that isn't uh, a traditional kind of SaaS. Um,
Hmm.
but I think with that in mind, as someone again who works in that space, you know, you must know that there are a lot of hubs, at least, worldwide, that can provide dedicated value for these businesses, especially when they're looking at green ventures or green business kind of scaling. And so, I know that, for example, if a company came to me today and they're out of, middle of nowhere, Indiana, but they have an incredible product, and they say, Charlie, I only have a couple grand in my pocket right now, and I need to go somewhere that really values my idea and my business and my company. Um, I'm not going to send them to, like Plano, Texas, or even somewhere like San Francisco. I mean, San Francisco's a great hub for innovation, but it's not for green space. I'm going to send them somewhere to maybe like Seattle, or maybe even come to New York in some instances. But, globally, where are the most friendly green innovation spaces that people can flock to?
Hmm. Great question. I think it varies a bit depending on point of time. And my thinking was I really enjoyed being part of the sustainability consulting space in Germany because Germany was certainly, and this is regulation driven, for example, through solar subsidies, feed-in tariffs, a really good place to build a business or de-scale a business in the climate tech space. So I think Europe overall, also France specifically, but a bunch of other European markets are really forward thinking and have great subsidy programs available. And I think slowly but surely also an investor ecosystem, obviously not as large as something you would find in the US, but still something where investors are really excited to create local champions for industries. So Europe, I think, is one of the responses. The other one is, and that's where I would contradict you a bit, is I actually moved specifically to San Francisco because many of the projects which I did in consulting and sustainability consulting were based out of San Francisco. And yes, it might not be for the massive companies here, although the tech companies that are in the Silicon Valley are um, very interested in sustainability measures across the board. But there are, for example, in the battery ecosystem, but also in the software, climate tech software ecosystem and other carbon capture, a lot of companies that are in the Bay Area here, they might not specifically sit in San Francisco, but really spread out around the entire Bay. But I think it's definitely a hub, at least in exciting technologies coming out of universities that are being commercialized, the first push which they're getting from investors. But then you're right, I think now especially it's a tough time to keep scaling certain technologies. But I would still say California is a great place. You can see a lot of grant opportunities becoming available on a state level, especially when grant opportunities on a federal level are drying out. So I think that's an interesting one here. I think also, and maybe I'm a bit biased, Southeast Asia is certainly an interesting market for sustainability. Maybe something like a Singapore, who are really thinking about how to source green electrons in the limited land they have. For example, they're building something called a sun cable to bring electricity from Australia to Singapore to power their energy-hungry economy. And certainly China, I've traveled there a bunch of times during my consulting times, but also different occasions. And they are really, if they are set on pushing a certain technology, really making it real. So China, for example, biggest solar installer by far. They might even actually install more solar than anyone else combined in a single year. And they're really interested in or really pushing battery technologies, EV technologies. They're a leader. And there many other technologies are pushed by China too. So I think these are a few big hubs, I would say. But I also want to make sure to not mention anyone who might do great sustainability efforts. Otherwise, I think there are great pockets. For example, DG Matrix is headquartered in Raleigh, North Carolina, and the Research Triangle area is definitely also pushing a lot of sustainability focused companies to grow.
Since we are talking about innovation and the future of energy, I'd like to have your point of view on what you think is coming in the future. I'd like you to tell us about what you think is promising in the ideas that we have today, and maybe also give us a talk about what you think of fusion energy and its potential.
Sure. Yeah. Um, I think self-servingly solid state transformers is certainly having its moment right now. It goes under the overarching umbrella of grid tech, or grid technologies, which are enabling the integration of different distributed energy generation resources, remote sites, intermittent renewable energy, and so forth. And there are a bunch of companies that are trying to commercialize this really complex technology. And I think that's happening as we're shipping right now our second generation pilots. So that's really picking up in terms of momentum. Other technologies that are really happening are carbon capture. I think there is great momentum. Some setbacks here and there, and certain consolidations happening, but our society has figured out that it's not only about making sure that the number of emissions or the volumes of emissions decreases, but humans, as they are a bit imperfect at times, definitely need another backup solution, and that's where carbon capture comes in, and significant amounts of funding are raised, and innovations are really happening still, and commercialization is happening. And then other technologies, fusion. I am very impressed by the progress that's happening. A bunch of companies raising many millions of dollars because it's very expensive to commercialize tech technologies. But there is a joke, and I'm not sure because I'm not an engineer, a nuclear engineer. But the joke is basically that fusion will always stay 8 to 10 years out. So even if we talk again in 8 to 10 years, fusion again will be told to be 8 to 10 years out from commercialization. But again, I hope the technology will be market ready and self-sustaining much earlier because we really need it. And I'm very technology agnostic. Whatever we can do to stop climate change will work and will be important. And I think a very interesting technology is space-based solar. Again, not an engineer, but based on what I see in the market, there were the first PPAs signed by a Californian utility around 10 years ago to harvest electrons by in space with massive solar panels. The lights never go off because the sun shines all the time there, so you have higher utilizations. You just need to find the right technology to send the electrons back to Earth and then make sure it feeds into our electric grids. So let's see, but there are a few company and funding announcements that happened in the past few weeks, and I hope that also works out somehow. So I think there are very exciting technologies in the pipeline and many more to come.
Yeah, most people don't know this about me, but I am actually a massive physics nerd. Um,
Nice.
and it is it's one of those things where there are just an innumerable like amount of problems that come with the world that we live in that we can't just like slightly bend one rule to make everything to work in the way that we want it to, and things like fusion or even that solar capture, the space solar capture is a really unique problem because it's like, okay, there's thousands and thousands of pieces of debris up there.
Mhm.
So that's why we can't just run a cable up there because something's gonna go smash through it, and then you made a multi-billion-dollar mistake, right? But I think there are so many different capabilities for us to you know champion green causes, um, and a lot of them feel very unattainable to the average, even professional, boots on the ground here. I am a big believer in dreaming big, but when you have these massive fundraisers or funding opportunities in the millions and millions of dollars, and you have the smartest people on earth figuring out how to capture greenhouse emissions, or even just prevent them in the first place. You're thinking like, okay, a random engineer or accountant or professional here doesn't really have a leg in the race, but that, from my understanding, can't be further from the truth. There are a
Mm.
lot of different areas that we can start looking in and investing in personally to really bring a better, greener, and not even just green for the sake of green, but green for the benefit of ourselves and our children and our children's children, that future into the light, right? And so you work on a macro scale, from my understanding, but you also have a unique background that puts you in the know for the micro scale as well. Uh,
Mhm.
You know, maybe you can let us know, what can an individual right now do to help further the causes that maybe you're working on individually, or even just champion things that you know about that individuals can get involved in today.
Yeah, sure. I think what you can do on a household or individual level is a bunch of initial ideas. And the heaviest hitters, I would say, are to, when it comes to CO2 emissions, think, for example, about when do you heat your home? How much do you heat your home? Or cool your home, depending on where you are. And since heating and cooling at a home are some of the biggest consumers of electrons or of gas, even if you change, for example, the set point of your thermostat by 1 degree or by 2 degrees, or if you, for example, install some kind of smart heating device, or something that controls your heating, such as a Google Nest or other smart thermostats, or for example, a Home Connect thing, then you can really make a difference just by making sure that whenever you heat or cool, you don't do it that much. and also deciding when you cool and do or when you heat in a smart way. And for example, don't heat or cool your home when you're not at home. Um, Separately, I think what's really interesting is you can make big changes in your diet. And I think you could obviously go as extreme as doing a fully vegetarian diet or a vegan diet. Vegetarian diet typically lowers your food-related footprint by around 20%, and the vegan one by 30%, which is massive. And if you, for example, make that change, and even if it's, for example, only once a week, not eating meat, or 2 times a week not eating meat, that's already something, if you do it or scale it up to a societal level, would make a huge dent. And I think something that's also interesting is, and something I've started doing is to buy emission offsets, or depending on whichever you want to call it, but the idea is to take out carbon out of the atmosphere. And you can do it in a nature-based way. For example, for whichever flight you take, you can let the airline or an independent portal, such as Atmosphere, calculate your CO2 footprint, and then buy high quality carbon capture or carbon emission certificates, and make sure that the CO2 is taken out of the atmosphere forever. Some, for example, Climeworks offer you up to 1,000 years of CO2 being safely stored in the ground, at a bit of a hefty price point. But that if you can afford it, and if you're really wondering what to do beyond saving electricity and making your diet a bit more vegetarian or vegan, then that would, for example, be the premium measure, which you could also do. And in practice, for example, often when friends have a baby or it's their birthday, then and I don't know what to give them, I'm leaning towards buying some of those certificates, high quality certificates, and giving it as a little present, to make sure that the baby can be CO2 neutral, at least for another year.
Wow. Okay. Whoa. So here we have actionable things that everyone can apply. So that's great because
Exactly.
Carbon
it's
neutral
always
baby
tricky.
is a thing that I've never heard of before, and I'm so glad we're coining that on this podcast. Carbon neutral babies.
Yeah, you can go to WITS and really figure out which country does the person live in, what's the age of a certain person, because at different ages you emit certain amounts of CO2, and then you can adjust it. Or for example, if you say, hey, would love you to visit me, but I really want to make sure that you're visiting me without without emitting in a net way CO2 emissions, then buy that certificate, for example. And I know it sounds like something which a bunch of people see really critical, because there are a lot of players in the space which are not doing high quality carbon capture. But if you really, for example, focus on certain organizations and buy high quality certificates, that's where you can really make a difference. And in a justified and honest way, the CO2 is taken out of the atmosphere.
It's also a great idea for people who love to travel and take the plane, or who regularly take the plane and feel bad about it, and or just would like to do something about it. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a great idea. Thomas, in the introduction, we made a promise to the listeners. We said that we're just not gonna talk about those microgrids and leave them, but that we will really take the time to explain what it is, because that's a big part of the work you are doing at DG Matrix. So, can you please tell us more about it?
Yeah, sure. So currently, our electric system is based on some big power plant, typically generates a lot of electrons. Then you have these wires, transmission and distribution lines that take these electrons to somewhere where it's being used. And everything is really on a massive scale system. And microgrids can be operated as a complete opposite to this. So for example, if you want to electrify a site that does not have electricity access yet, you could set up different generation sources, for example, solar, wind, a fuel cell powered by hydrogen or potentially by natural gas, or whichever other generation source that works for you. And then have a local grid set up where, independent of these massive electricity lines, you can make sure that the lights stay on. And often, obviously, the sun doesn't always shine, the wind isn't always there either. You need a buffer, so that could be a battery, another thing that you integrate there. And then you can have on the load side, so the consumption side, you could have your general loads, for example, your entire lights that need to stay on, but you can also have critical loads. And I think that's where I can make it a bit more specific. So in general, where you don't have a great electric grid, which is often actually the case here in the US, many supermarkets are coming to us, the big grocery chains, and are telling us the grid is unreliable whenever there is a hurricane or extensive rainfalls or forest fires in the area, the grid gets shut down or breaks. So for energy independence, it makes sense to set up a microgrid. And it's a tiny grid that connects to the major grid. You don't even need to. You can also go in island mode, but where you make sure that your electricity is on even when the big grid is not able to deliver.
So essentially, it's kind of providing not just more reliable electricity, but in a way that kind of descales this need for massive networks. Ultimately, and this is just me assuming, reducing the amount of resources needed to create these large scale endeavors, right? I mean, it's much easier to create a smaller work site and maybe a smaller net infrastructure, costs less steel, costs less manpower, costs less, electricity and trucks moving stuff versus, building a huge super network of cables and wires that cost, who knows how much in terms of not just the actual building expenses, but also the steel, the amount
Mhm.
of transportation needed. So really, by scaling this down, you're not just saving money, you're not just making a more reliable product, but you're also creating less need for this resource drain, correct?
Mhm. Exactly, that's correct. Yeah, you don't have these big scale systems anymore. And I think what a massive advantage of microgrids is too is you don't need to wait for the utility to provide sufficient electricity, which is often the case now, where you're saying, hey, I want to set up this electric vehicle charging station, or I want to set up a data center. And the utility tells you, well, we have such a massive queue of backlog. We can make sure, or we can promise you electrons in around 5 years. And you're just telling them, hey guys, I can't wait for 5 years. The demand for EVs is already here. They need to get charged somehow. And this is a really important location to set up the charging station. So what can we do? And then we can come in and say, okay, you have a solution immediately available, limited permitting. You can probably have it ready in 6 months with all the permitting. And then you can wait for the utility. And if they ever come back to you and interconnect you with a proper interconnection that delivers all the electrons, we can scale in line. We can, for example, still use our power electronics equipment to make your site operate. And we can, for example, have the excess electricity which the solar on site generates now feed back into the grid and help you make money with it.
That's incredible, and an incredible thing that I think most people don't know maybe about green resources like solar panels or solar energy is that if you have an excess amount of energy, it's not just stored; you can sell it back to any kind of you know uh, uh, electric provider that you
Mhm.
have plugged into. But I'm so curious about the business application of this because it sounds to me, right, like you are decentralizing kind of the need for, uh, utility services, but also maybe creating a really interesting opportunity for kind of niche services, mom and pop electricity providers, essentially, in terms of like these
Mhm.
smaller networks. So I'm sure there has to be kind of like a plan, maybe like even a secondary value of creating more opportunity for like rural areas, or creating business owners inside of those more traditionally impoverished areas. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
hmm Yeah, indeed. It's not only about making sure that the lights stay on at a grocery store or at an EV charging station or at a hotel. It's really all about electrifying remote areas. And you're right. Often, for example, in tribal areas here in the US, where you have populations of indigenous folks, they are often also under electrified, and they have maybe this one really old distribution line that reaches them, and then there are yearly floodings, and often poles break or the foundations of the poles are flushed away. So they go without electricity until all of this is fixed. So why not really just have a local microgrid set up there, with locally generated electrons, and give them energy independence? And the good thing is this is often is actually much cheaper on, they call it the levelized cost of electricity. So how much you pay for each kilowatt hour delivered, than relying on the big grid. And it's a really great thing, I think, also to give fair access to energy, to really remote areas here in the United States, but globally. So our company, for example, has roots with Pakistan and India, and that's where a lot of regions are not really nicely electrified yet. And our founder's mission is also to go back to where they're coming from, and at some point make sure to deploy microgrids there, to also make sure to electrify everyone and ensure the lights stay on, people being able to study or work even at night, which is a huge game changer as opposed to having to rely on daylight or candles.
Oh, that's interesting because when we think of energy and the challenges that we face today, we tend to only talk about the fact that we will need a lot more energy in areas where we already need a lot. But
hmm
in fact, there are still many areas in the world where energy is not a guarantee. You don't have you don't have energy all the time. And so by tackling the problem of giving more energy to the world that is clean, you also tackle this side issue that it seems no one's talking about.
100%. Yeah. I think it's a conversation coming from privilege that we need to make sure that here in the US or in Europe, electricity is on even for longer and more electricity is delivered. Whereas in many other regions, there's just no electricity or no reliable electricity. And if there is one fridge in the village or one tiny supermarket in the village relying on electricity to cool goods, but then electricity all of a sudden for hours or days or weeks is not available, then the food expires, medicine expires, and unfortunately, you're in a really bad situation.
I think there is a lot of benefit that we get from investing in kind of smaller scale, repeatable venture that creates impact, or I guess direct impact to the communities that it's brought to. But, I think when we imagine what green innovation looks like, it's maybe not the most, uh, um, I guess, directly attainable change that we can see, right? I think one of the biggest problems that most of green initiatives have is that the benefit comes years down the line. The same
hmm
way that a non-for-profit, their investors um, don't get the direct benefit right then and there. It's, you know, the people that they help, the same way that, you know, green initiatives and green companies, their direct beneficiaries aren't the people that put the money in directly. It's going to be the generations of people that end up receiving the benefit down the line, hopefully, if we're all still here.
Hmm.
Uh, and so, you know, with that kind of imagery in mind and that kind of, you know, far-seeing future ahead, is there something that you've personally maybe experienced that you can see the direct benefit from, even if it was like an investment years ago that you know doesn't really um produce like a short-term gain, but something that you've seen in your time
Mm.
that created a benefit for those around you?
Yes, I think a great example is the solar industry, how Germany specifically pushed it through feed-in tariffs, really generous subsidies for everyone who installed solar panels and feeds it back into the grid, which led to the build out of millions of home solar systems in Germany. And then at some point, many other countries imitating this. And then at some point, really driving down the solar cost curve. So um, experts really attribute the solar revolution and the commercialization of it to a bold German government's policy back in the day that now, which whose fruits we're harvesting right now with having solar available with great supply chains at a really low cost everywhere in the world. And I think that's, for example, a story which evolved over the past, like, I guess 10, 15 years to really bear fruit. But I think it's a really great success story that happened.
Yeah. Wow. Thomas, you're in a unique position because you're someone with a business background who is in a field that is full of engineers.
Hmm.
And could you give us some tips or things that you learned on how to communicate with engineers, because that's often an area that non-engineers struggle to do. How to get understood, how to make sure that the engineers communicate what really matters to me. Can you please give us your insights on this?
Of course. Yeah. And you know what the funny thing is? Often I wish I had an electrical engineering degree because of the environment I'm currently in. Um, but at the same time, I'm also very appreciative of having chosen the business route. And something which I'm really benefiting from is if you have the business perspective in mind, or you're typically the person who talks to the customers, you really need to figure out from the customers what they really need in order to make their purchasing decisions, and how do you generate product market fit. So not only have from an engineering perspective an excellent product, but also something that's actually sellable and profitable. And I think what I'm bringing into the many conversations I'm having with engineers is that customer perspective, but also really thinking about what does the customer really mean? What do they really want versus what is something that they would like to have, but is rather wishful thinking for the moment, where they would already make their purchasing decision if certain table stakes things are in place, but these additional things are maybe implemented later. So I think that's one of the points, bringing the customer perspective and also isolating or synthesizing what's really important for the engineers to act on. Another interesting thing is, um, from a startup perspective, obviously our funding is a bit limited for now. And we do a lot of pilot projects and are really grateful about these pilot projects and site hosts and partner companies that believe in us and are excited to have this technology installed before it's actually fully commercialized. And the issue there can be, if we don't manage it properly from a business perspective, to end up in, some people call it science project hell, where engineers really love geeking out on the technology, but unfortunately, it never really has the ultimate purpose in mind of how do we then leverage our findings there and how do we showcase our technology there to scale the sales. Some people also call it pilotitis as some kind of issue, because the ultimate goal is not to have the pilot and have more and more pilots and test out things. The ultimate goal is really to sell many more units and excite a lot of other people about it. So I think that's where I can also take a really proactive stance and make sure that we have all of these business interests also factored in to see through the technical progress, but also to make sure in the meantime that the commercial momentum keeps picking up.
What a cool kind of concept and segue, because there is uh such a unique parallel to what you're doing to kind of combine the practicality of these green ventures and these green businesses, uh, but also to give a level of inspiration and validation really to these pie in the sky ideas, these dreams of engineers that want to do incredible and massive things. Because Jeff and I started this podcast because we had this pie in the sky idea that we like really cool people and we want to get
Mhm.
to know them, and want to get to understand where they are, where they came from, and why they do what they do. But in doing so, we recognize that it would be a completely selfish endeavor to just talk about it, and not let our listener figure out at least one really cool thing that can get them to their next phase in maybe their life, their career, moving forward. And so, with that in mind, uh, Thomas, what we usually do is we ask our very accomplished, very dedicated, and you know inspirational guests, what is one skill that you've developed in this time from falling in love with this green technology as a child, all the way up through your time in management consulting and now building these green companies and scaling them? What's one skill that has served you so well that someone can start working on today?
Yeah, great question. I think what really benefited me is, and I might end up mentioning two things, and we can select from which is the more helpful here.
Listen,
But
two is a bargain. That's two for one for us. So
that sounds great. The first one is really the skill of figuring out what's important and how to communicate it in the right way to the right people to land the message and get them to act. And I definitely made really a lot of progress throughout my career on building this out and struggled with it in the beginning, my first job, I have to admit. But I think especially my time in management consulting really helped me to create and craft these good stories and these stories that actually land, and how to help me how to convince senior leaders to act on initiatives, for example, which I propose to make the change. And I think what can be helpful there is there's for example, Barbara Minto's book on the pyramid principle, which really explains how effective, or one way of really effective communication, sending or focusing, for example, on the key message first, then having some additional facts lined up that would help you make that point, and then having more details lined up if the conversation ever goes there. But that pyramid shaped or pyramid focused communication is something which I really appreciated. And keep focusing on. I think the second one is networking. And I know it's something which many people see as, oh, this is a really painful thing, and this is really something I need to force myself to do, and it's an awkward thing because I need to approach people. And honestly, I still find it sometimes awkward, but whenever I overcome this threshold and push myself to keep doing it, and by now I really enjoy it. I, for example, really loved attending San Francisco Climate Week, or the Advanced Clean Transportation Conference recently. It's a great opportunity to not only get your thoughts out, but also to test your thoughts, which is important, especially as a startup, and plant a lot of seeds, and especially when it comes to having a new technology which is not understood or known of by many people by now or now yet. To promoting that technology is a really helpful thing. And I'm also a huge fan of planting these seeds, not only in the sense of doing favors to other people, helping out other people, connecting other people with other folks in my network so they can, for example, solve difficult problems, talk to an expert, or get investing. But I think also planting seeds and really proactively giving is, and not necessarily knowing what you're going to harvest at some point or if you're going to harvest at some point, is really something that gives me a lot of joy and something which I would recommend people to do more.
We're gonna
Wow,
start
yes.
having a tally. It's an inside joke because either things go back to one of two things in this podcast. It's either networking or Toastmasters. Those are the two areas that we
Great.
usually
I
hit.
used to do
Um,
Toastmasters too, and I'm a
Oh,
fan.
yes.
oh, we got a two for
That's
one. See, Jeff, equal representation.
No, I definitely noticed that I need to build my skill set in terms of improving my speaking skills. And I think it really made a difference, and I really enjoyed the process. And there's always so much more to learn.
Oh yes, and Thomas, to be honest, it's an amazing answer that you gave us, because here we are talking with someone who's at the intersection of business and engineering in a very competitive domain with a lot of potential, but also a lot of need. And you mentioned two skills. First one is to figure out the most important and communicate it to the right people in the right way. For example, by using storytelling in order to convince the right people, which is basically what I'm doing. And then you mentioned networking, which I know, Charles, that's your thing. So it wasn't planned. It just wanted to tell that the listeners that this wasn't planned. This is completely we didn't see it coming, but it fits it fits the show very well, and I can only push on those two skills that really are change everything, and that are sometimes not the ones that you might think. People tend to focus on hard skills, but when you think leverage, when you think, that's where you that's that's where you go. Thomas, thank you so much for having demystified a little bit of this very complex landscape of energy and the future, um, and for having given us insights. Now, there is a
Of
question I would
course.
like to ask you that we ask all of our guests. It's not yet finished, and it's a hard question, because this is the magic microphone question. You will have 2 minutes to talk in the magic microphone. And the magic microphone is magic because it allows you to send a message on everyone who's present on the planet, who's present today, but even to those who are not born yet. It's your chance to give a universal and timeless message to everyone. what would you like to share?
I want to take it back to the overall theme that I'm pursuing around stopping climate change, which is a massive task where many people might think, what can I do differently? How can I influence all of this as an individual? Where you have big corporations that emit a lot of CO2. How am I going to make a difference here? And I think similar to in a democracy, right, where you have a massive system in place, you only quote unquote have a single vote, you are still somehow making a difference just by the vote that you're giving. And if you draw the parallels, for example, to you being part of stopping climate change, I think you certainly have a big say and you can make a difference. And the difference is not only by your individual actions, for example, of thinking about how to lower your electricity demand or gas demand by being smart about how you heat or cool your home, or not only about the diet that where you do maybe a meatless meal once a week, once more than you typically do. But I think you also have a massive opportunity to convince other people by leading by example and talking about these things, to scale your impact slowly but surely. And as you can see, for example, what my parents did, being some of the first ones to install rooftop solar, that ultimately really led to many of the neighbors installing rooftop solar too and feeling more comfortable to do it, feeling like they're not the only ones part of this journey, but really being part of a bigger movement to make a change there. And then ultimately, it's not only the actions that you do at home and the influencing that you do, you can certainly also then cast your vote, for example, for a Green Party. You can, for example, also participate in local protests against a facility that you don't want to get installed there because it's a heavily polluting fossil fuel power plant, and maybe make the case for proposing alternatives such as a solar plus battery solution. And I think going back to the original theme of stopping climate change and that you're only one person and can only do so much, for example, remove a few tons of CO2 from the atmosphere or prevent it from getting there. There is really so much more that you can achieve by influencing others and by leading by example.
Wow, incredible. I'm so glad that we had this conversation because it really shows not just the incredible work that you are doing, but also the really inescapable power that we all have as individuals to band together to do something incredible. Um, Thomas, thank you so much for joining us. Where can we find you, or where can we find your work, and how can we support you?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. In terms of how to find me, um, definitely feel free to reach out through LinkedIn. That's www.linkedin.com/Thomas Schuldt. And check out our company website under dgmatrix.com. And I would say that's already a great start. And I'd be very intrigued to have follow-up conversations and to any outreaches that might result from this podcast, and keep geeking out more about how to make sustainability happen, how to stop climate change, and how to um, generate value at the intersection of sustainability and technology.
Incredible.
Yes,
Yeah,
oh,
awesome.
and thank you very much for this very powerful message. Lead the change, because you embody this notion. Your parents were leading at the time where no one were doing it, and you got inspired, and now you are leading yourself towards a better future. And this is wow. This is okay. Just wanna do to add this because
Agreed.
it's really a beautiful beautiful message, and a super way to end this podcast episode.
Appreciate your support. Yeah, thanks for having me here.
Absolutely. Ladies and gentlemen, if you made it this far, thank you so much for joining us. Make sure to like, subscribe, send this to a friend, especially now that you have so much actionable intel on how to help fight climate change. And remember to tune in every Wednesday for a new episode of Casualty Pro. Thanks so much for joining us. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.